Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Adams. This is the former Alabama All-American Mike Johnson. This is Path to Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. 4 all, 4 less. Over the course of the next few minutes, we're going to have a lot of fun as we take a look at what's going to happen tonight when the college football playoff top 25 is revealed. We'll give our predictions for who we think's moving up, who we think's moving down. We'll actually give you the rankings as they're announced in Grapevine, Texas. We'll preview the SEC championship between Auburn and Georgia and sort of figure out where all this is going by the time Sunday afternoon gets here. And this is that time of year where all the debate that's led up to this, it all actually comes to fruition right now, and we could not have better drama, Mike.
Boy, I would not want to be on that college football playoff committee ranking team tonight, kind of put out these, a couple of huge losses at the top of the rankings from last week with number 1 Alabama and number 2 Miami going down, now with the championship games around the corner. A lot of tough decisions to be made in that room.
And you know, one of the things that's going to make the decision for the committee tougher is what happened for Alabama and Auburn in the Iron Bowl this past Saturday. As we kind of recap what happened last week, you know, for me, I know this is no consolation for Alabama fans. I do get that. But in terms of if that was a game that's going to propel Auburn in the college football playoff, it was a game worthy of that kind of conversation. Right. Because I thought Alabama and Auburn threw haymakers at each other all Saturday long, and every conference championship should be determined in as physical a way as Auburn in the win against Alabama. What a setup for Saturday's SEC championship game.
Yeah, somewhat of a quarterfinal game when you talk about that Iron Bowl down there in Jordan-Hare Stadium. And it wasn't like Auburn just absolutely ran away with the game. At times they did in the second half, but Alabama traded some blows with them. In the end, I think the home field advantage was a little bit much for Alabama to overcome, and Auburn gets all the credit. They've looked like a championship caliber team for the most part of the year.
We'll find out in just a moment where Auburn's going to be ranked in the college football playoff top 25 this week, number 6 last week. Moving up, we would assume how high? Well, it depends on everything else that's going on there. We'll have that conversation. Also, later on tonight, we will preview the big SEC championship matchup between Georgia and Auburn. That's going to be a lot of fun there as well. Now, speaking of where Auburn's going to come in the rankings tonight, let's talk about some of those teams that we expect to be risers in the rankings tonight. Obviously, one of those is Auburn. You have a sense about how high you think Auburn's going to be climbing up in the polls tonight?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think that they're probably going to land somewhere right around 3. I think that you put Clemson and probably Oklahoma right in front of Auburn right now. They have the 2 huge wins against the number 1 teams, but they still have 2 losses on the slate, and that loss to LSU. In my mind, they're right there at number 3 in the country, but they know what they have to do. The rankings won't matter for them tonight. They've got to win this weekend.
What I think is interesting, though, is as much credit as you want to give Auburn, it's the team on our graphic there listed above Auburn, Clemson, that does make it kind of an interesting comparison for the committee, because while I thought that Auburn sent an incredible message in terms of how it handled Alabama on Saturday, boy, that night, now not a high profile of a game because South Carolina is not as premier of an opponent, but Clemson, I thought really sent a message that, hey, if you're talking about these other teams, if you've forgotten about us, we're still the defending champion. Yes, Deshaun Watson may be gone. Kelly Bryant may be in as quarterback. But I thought Clemson sent a real message that as we move towards that Final Four and the ACC championship on Saturday, ignore Clemson at your own peril. They are definitely, I believe, a big riser tonight.
I completely agree with you. Kelly Bryant has been everything he was advertised to be this year. That only loss coming on the road against Syracuse on that weird Friday night where Kelly Bryant gets injured. They look like every bit the defending national champions. You wondered what they'd be without Deshaun Watson and how they'd kind of attack this game here in the final game of the regular season against Jake Bentley and Will Muschamp and a growing South Carolina team. They went in and handled business. And you talk about the game winding up 34-10. I don't even know if it was that close. It was closer than last year's blowout in this game, but Clemson did everything they wanted to in that game and ran away with it in the end.
Let me talk about one more riser here. For me, that's the Pac-12. And, you know, you and I have talked about this in our program in the afternoons a lot of the last couple of days. I think one of the stories that has not gotten enough discussion until now is the fact that the Pac-12 is still in this thing. The Stanford win against Notre Dame helps that. USC kind of on the rise here late, getting a win against their in-state rival UCLA, forgetting about the debacle against Notre Dame early in the season. I think on Friday night, when the Pac-12 has its conference championship between Stanford and USC, I think the winner of that game, if it's USC, is actually still in the mix for a playoff spot. Now, it needs some help. It needs some help in a big way. Stanford as the winner, probably not getting in on just based the virtue of the loss to San Diego State. But I believe that USC, were it to win the game on Friday, puts the Pac-12 potentially back in the college football playoff conversation, which is relevant right now for Alabama fans who are watching us online.
Yeah, it's a huge reason. I think when you look at what USC is, everybody kind of fell asleep on their title chances. You know, they had a couple of losses this year when you look at Washington State, when you look at Notre Dame, but a chance to can really add a quality win playing Stanford this week. Stanford coming off that huge 18-point victory against Notre Dame. USC sat idle, so they got to stay home. They got to rest up. If they can go in and really beat Stanford handily, I wouldn't count them out either.
Yeah, well, let me get a few comments. We'll take a look at some of our fallers who's dropping. William Cook says Auburn lost to Clemson and LSU. They don't deserve to be in the playoffs. William, I think the thing that we're going to say about Auburn here, though, is a little bit like what we just said about USC, that this is a long season. 12 games is a lot of data points, and some of those are going to be good, some of those are going to be bad, and I think that it's the totality of the information here that you have to give credit to here. And yes, Auburn did lose to a Clemson, but made some adjustments on the heels of that. You know, changing the personnel along the offensive line, you know, giving maybe more of the control of the offense over to Chip Lindsey. I mean, I think at that point in time, Auburn is a different team than it was after it lost to Clemson.
Listen, you got to give Auburn credit for going on the road to both Death Valleys. Yes, they lost both the games, but, you know, they were both single, you know, score victories when you talk about the losses against Clemson and against LSU. Not only that, but they played 3 number 1 teams this year and went 2-1 in those games. I think you have to give Auburn credit for the schedule that they played. It was not an easy schedule. Anytime you look at those matchups and their ability in the last couple of weeks, obviously they've gotten to be a much better team. That win this weekend could possibly cap off one great second half of the year.
We're about to get some of our rankings coming in. We'll give them to you here live on our Path to the Playoff show tonight, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors, for all 4 less. Before that, let's predict some of these teams that we think are going to be falling in tonight's rankings, and one of these off the top, pretty easy to discuss here, and that's the Alabama Crimson Tide. The big question about Alabama, though, Mike, is how far do they fall? Now, the one problem for Tide fans is, and we said this afternoon on our show, I don't know that tonight's ranking for Alabama is actually predictive of where it's going to be on Sunday in the ranking that truly matters. My guess is Alabama still ranks ahead of Ohio State tonight, but I don't know that that's still true if Ohio State wins the Big Ten on Saturday.
Yeah, I think if anything, what you're paying attention to tonight is how far ahead of Ohio State is Alabama. Can Ohio State make up that ground? Now, if Alabama's sitting at 5 and Ohio State's 6, you can bet your bottom dollar that next week, if Ohio State's able to beat Wisconsin, they will leapfrog and idle Alabama. But if Alabama's sitting at 5 and Ohio State's still back there around 8, then you have to believe that the committee favors Alabama in that head-to-head.
Let me talk about another team that's going to be falling tonight. That's the Miami Hurricanes. Now, I still believe that Miami-Clemson for the ACC Championship is a win-and-you're-in scenario. I think either of those two teams makes the college football playoff. But Miami showed on Friday against Pitt that this is a pretender. This is not a national championship contender. Whether it be Mark Richt's curious decision to bench his quarterback, whether it be Miami sort of messing around with another team that's not among the national elite, Miami's lost and been losing at halftime so many times this year. Could not get it done late against Pitt. Miami's going to fall tonight, and they deserve to. It was a joke they were number 2 in the country last week. This team's not winning the national championship. They don't deserve to be in the playoff, but they might actually go.
Well, they're going to have every opportunity to beat Clemson this weekend, and I think that once you put everything on the line for Miami, Mark Richt can coach in these championship games. He's shown the ability to do that in the past and rise his teams to the occasion. If they can beat Clemson, then yes, they will slip into that top 4. I think the really big discussion here is all year we've talked about the possibility of maybe 2 SEC teams, you know, whether it be Alabama and Georgia or Auburn and Georgia. Can they get 2 teams from one conference in? I think that went away for the ACC with Miami losing this past weekend against Pitt. I think you win that conference championship game and you're in, but there's no longer the ability to have a one-loss conference champion loser still slide in. That is a win and you're in type of game.
We've got the rankings coming in. We'll start to give you those coming up in just a moment. Let me talk about one more team that we expect to fall. Now, this was a team that I actually predicted might fall last week, and they actually moved up in the rankings, but my guess is falling tonight will be Mississippi State. Now, I assume that the Bulldogs will stay in the rankings, but after the committee showed them some love last week, they lose to Ole Miss. My guess is you're not going to see much of that from the committee tonight when it comes to the Bulldogs.
Yeah, I don't know where they stop. I don't know where the tumbling kind of stops. Every team behind them kind of dealt with business this past week. When you look at UCF, Michigan State beating Rutgers handily, Washington able to knock off Washington State, LSU handily over Texas A&M. I don't know. I don't know where the slippage starts to end. I think that if you're looking at Mississippi State and if you're a Mississippi State fan, you're happy to be holding on right there at 22 or 23.
And the committee has kept Mississippi State in the top 25, but just barely. They do come in at number 23 tonight. We'll show you the rest of these college football playoff rankings in just a moment. Let me remind you of who we are, what we're doing. Let me say thanks for being with us here tonight. It's our Path to the Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. For all 4 less. This is Mike Johnson, the former Alabama All-American. My name is Brandon Adams. We will give you the rankings as they are released, and then we'll do what we do all the time here around SEC country. We'll debate. We'll debate who's ranked where tonight, who's supposed to be there coming after Sunday. We'll talk about who's going to win these games this weekend, including Georgia and Auburn, and we'll do a lot of that with you in the comment section here as well. In fact, let me pull up some of these comments right now. Let's talk about what's going on here. Randall Vinston says, Alabama and Auburn for the championship, and we'll take care of business again. War Eagle. Here's the thing about that, Randall. It's not Alabama that Auburn's going to play again. At least right now, it's going to be Georgia in the SEC championship, and that should be a fun one.
Well, I think it's interesting, too. If he is talking about the national title game, there always lands that possibility as well. If Alabama lands at a 4 and Auburn at a 2, that they could face off later on in the season. I think a lot of Alabama fans and Auburn fans kind of clamor for that matchup.
That's the top 6, though. For now, let's get ready to look at 7 through 25 as these rankings come in. Some of the teams that are, frankly, probably glad to still be in the top 25 and maybe still knocking on the door here. You see Mississippi State coming in at 23. They're ahead of both NC State, Fresno State, another group of 5 team in the rankings this week. Then it's Virginia Tech, Northwestern, Memphis, Oklahoma State, Washington State. LSU comes in at number 17, and I might have expected a little more from the LSU Tigers here than number 17.
Yeah, I would have too. I think it hands back to not a lot of teams in front of them really were able to lose. You look at Washington State and Mississippi State both kind of sliding down, but LSU only able to climb up 1 spot. I think that tells you the tale of their season so far.
You see Michigan State 16, Notre Dame drops to 15 after the loss to Stanford. UCF moves up to 14, but there's a real ceiling there for the highest ranked group of 5 team. No desire among the committee whatsoever to move UCF anywhere close to a playoff conversation, despite the fact that Scott Frost had that team undefeated.
Yeah, I agree. Look at a tough game for them this last weekend against their rival, against South Florida. Really a crazy game, ends on a kickoff return for UCF, so they're not able to really gain any ground on some of those top teams.
Then as we look at the rest of these rankings, take a look at where Stanford is in the poll, take a look at where USC is. Stanford at 12, USC at 10. Mike, I'm going to tell you that USC, by virtue of beating Stanford on Saturday, I think they do put themselves in that conversation the way we talked about. I think the Pac-12 championship game matters.
Yeah, I think it's tough. I think the committee is going to have a tough choice ahead of them. I just think that's too much ground to kind of climb. When you talk about going from 10 to possibly 4, there's so many other teams in front of them that are playing in such big games this weekend. It's going to be a tough task for me to think that USC jumps over an Ohio State team, possibly a two-loss TCU team beating Oklahoma.
Esteban Estevez says it's BS, but LSU should have moved up more. LSU never gets any love from the polls. Maybe an example of that. How about TCU at 11? They play Oklahoma. That's a game I think the Horned Frogs can win. Is 11 with a victory against Oklahoma? What does that do for Gary Patterson's team?
Oh, boy. I mean, I think that a lot of Alabama fans that I've talked to are rooting for TCU to possibly do that. It opens up possibly another door. But Oklahoma won this game handily a few weeks ago, and I think you have to think, if you're a Big 12 fan, that Oklahoma goes out and takes care of business again. If TCU is able to win, they're right there in the conversation with USC and knocking on the door.
Then you saw Miami at 7, Ohio State at 8. Ohio State very much symbolic of what we were saying about Alabama before. I don't think you can read too much into Ohio State being an 8 right now, and I know that's going to be the hot topic, not just around SEC country where a lot of folks don't like the Buckeyes, but really around the country overall where I think there is some Ohio State fatigue here. At number 8, with a chance to play Wisconsin on Saturday, it's a game that the Buckeyes are a big favorite in. I think Ohio State is going to win that game despite the fact that Wisconsin has the higher ranking and the undefeated schedule. How much do you make of Ohio State when they come in? I think even at number 8, they are still very much alive for a playoff spot.
I definitely think they are too, but the interesting thing is to look at last year and how they got the benefit of the doubt as not a conference champion, did not make it in. They're kind of facing a similar scenario to what Alabama is this year. Guess what? They didn't do the committee any favors the way they performed in that game last year against Clemson in that semifinal game. They lost 31-0. I don't know if the committee is willing to overlook what happened last year and crown a team that has 2 losses, one by 31 points on the road to Iowa, by the way.
Terrence Collins says Ohio State does not need to be in, and Terrence, so reflective of so many SEC fans. Terrence is a Georgia fan, but so many SEC fans who are just tired of this. And if Ohio State does get in, and I think there's a really good chance that it does, that's a real problem for the committee because, Mike, it'll be, in a lot of people's mind, the 3rd time in the 4-year history of the playoff that Ohio State's gotten the benefit of the doubt. Happened in 2014 after a bad loss to Virginia Tech. Happened last season when Ohio State wasn't even conference champion, and may happen again because Ohio State would be conference champions. That's a really tough argument for the committee to make. But if you look at it, there are some numbers to kind of back this up.
Yeah, I agree, and I think as a Southern football fan, ACC, SEC guys are looking at the Big Ten and looking and saying, listen, Michigan State in 2015 absolutely routed by Alabama, and Ohio State again last year 31-0 against Clemson. So does a Big Ten team really deserve the benefit of the doubt? I think we're going to be knowing a lot about how the committee feels about that with these rankings out tonight.
Bill Molinari says the Big Ten teams are always terrible in bowls, playoff no different, and boy, that's one of those things that does kind of burn you about Ohio State, the fact that just last year we saw them not belong on the same field with Clemson. You'd like to think the committee is going to stick to its word of making every year an evaluation of its own, but these are humans that are still making this decision. Is there some of last year's stuff that creeps into this conversation?
I have to think that the loss against Oklahoma earlier this year is a huge weighing factor on the College Football Playoff Committee. You're looking at a playoff team in Oklahoma that routed Ohio State on its home field earlier this year in a head-to-head matchup. So I think in the back of the committee's mind, they say, hey, are we going to put this team back in and the possibility that they get routed again? I don't think they get the benefit of the doubt.
We'll give you the top 6 teams in the college football playoff here in just a moment. For now, let's take a few more comments. Kevin Benson says Wisconsin hasn't played a ranked team, so when Ohio State beats them, you will see they deserve to be there over Alabama. So that's Kevin weighing in on that. It's funny, when you look at the relative softness of Wisconsin's schedule, plus compare the Wisconsin players to the typical SEC athlete. In a weird way, Ohio State in the playoff, even with 2 losses, is less of a problem for me than a Wisconsin team that just looking at them, they don't belong. I mean, Wisconsin does not belong in this playoff. I don't care what their record is. I don't have as much of a problem with Ohio State because at least it's 4- and 5-star talent. Wisconsin is, I don't even know what. It's like, Rudy Rudiger all over the field.
Yeah, it is one thing to say that, your team lost to an Oklahoma-bound team that's probably going to make the college football playoff. It's another thing to say that, your team never even played a team like that. And listen, Ohio State's a good team. Wisconsin's a good team. But in the end, Wisconsin hasn't shown me enough matchups this year. Not really by their own fault. They haven't shown me enough matchups this year to say they deserve to win. If they do, for some crazy reason, are able to beat Ohio State this weekend, that's only one quality wall still in their corner. They were able to handle business this past weekend against their rival in Minnesota, but still not enough on the table. If they are able to win this game, I'm not sure that Wisconsin would be on the outside.
All right, well, we know what the top 6 is for right now. It's a precursor to championship weekend. Let's take a look at it. Hot off the presses here from Grapevine, Texas. And Clemson, after being demoted last week behind their conference rival Miami, is number 1 this week. Auburn vaults ahead to number 2. No problem with that. Oklahoma and Wisconsin occupy the number 3, the number 4 spot, and then SEC only for those 2 coveted 5 and 6 spots, both Alabama and Georgia. Interesting that Alabama gets the nod over Georgia here when, by almost any metric, Georgia's played a tougher schedule than Alabama. I guess this is by virtue of the fact that Alabama played Auburn a more narrow margin of victory than Georgia did. So kind of an interesting statement by the committee there, but what do you make of the top 6 here?
I think it's huge to point out the fact that Alabama is at 5 and Ohio State still at 8. I think that makes it such a tougher margin to really be able to jump if you're Ohio State and jump over an idle Alabama team this weekend, no matter what happens between Ohio State and Wisconsin. Yes, the opportunity is still there, but to me, those are the biggest 2 rankings coming into this final weekend. Alabama at 5, Ohio State at 8.
So I'll say on this show what I say on our afternoon show every single day. Y'all got to realize I'm the biggest SEC homer in the world. I want all 4 SEC teams in the college football playoff. But what I feel is concerning about what you just said is it's ignoring precedent. To say, well, right now Alabama's at 5, Ohio State's at 8. Even if it beats Wisconsin, how much is it going to move up? The committee's shown us in the past it does what it wants to do. Alabama at 5 right now. Tell that to TCU and Baylor, who got leapfrogged by Ohio State in 2014 because that's what the committee wanted to do. Of all the rankings that have little bearing on what the final ranking is, this one may have the least bearing of all.
It's definitely possible. I just think the committee right there, they did themselves a favor putting Alabama at 5. I think that you could have easily slid Alabama behind Georgia, behind another one-loss team in Miami, could have slid them to 7 and put them right in front of Ohio State. But the fact that there's that much difference in their mind between Ohio State right now and where Alabama sits at number 5, I think tells you the tale. Now, I'm not saying that either one of those teams will find their way in. I just think that the head-up matchup between those 2, if it came down to them, this ranking tells me a little bit of a story.
Darren Matt quoting a quote that's out there from Nick Saban right now. Anyone who doesn't win their conference championship has no business playing the national championship game. That quote's everywhere, but my understanding is that's not an actual Nick Saban quote. He didn't actually say that. Now, people have said that before, but Saban wasn't one of them.
No, he was definitely not one of them. And it is irritating to a lot of Alabama people that that's floating out around there. It's completely false. He never approached it from that angle. I think it was a quote from 2002 where he kind of said something similar like that, but the BCS was a completely different deal at that time.
Valeria Macy is arguing about the idea of Georgia being number 6. I don't know if Valeria says it's too high, too low, but what did you make of Georgia coming in number 6 here? I'm putting Georgia ahead of Alabama. I'm flip-flopping Alabama and Georgia 5 and 6. Georgia's just played the tougher schedule. You know, Georgia's gone on the road and win at Notre Dame. The best win thus far for Alabama is a Mississippi State team that Alabama snuck past that Georgia blew out 31-3.
Well, Georgia got them at home. Alabama went on the road and played them. I understand what you're saying. I tend to think that Georgia possibly played a tougher schedule as well. When you look at how Notre Dame ended up panning out, when you look at the way Florida State on Alabama's side ended up panning out. But to me, I think that this is the committee looking at it and saying, you know what, Georgia's still playing this weekend. That's another reason I point to Alabama sitting there at 5. The committee kind of has them on the back burner, right on the outside looking in, but still respects their schedule. I think the only reason they are at 5 and 6 in the order they are is because of the way both those teams played against Auburn. I think that Alabama just played a little bit closer.
That is Mike Johnson. My name is Brandon Adams. This is Path to the Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. Academy Sports and Outdoors, 4 all, 4 less. Those are the rankings. We'll continue to break them down and talk about them, including with you. You see the top 6 there one more time. Clemson, Auburn, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Alabama, and Georgia knocking on the door. Continue to weigh in the comment section. We'll speak to you about that throughout the evening here tonight on our Path to Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. But for a moment, Mike, let me talk about the team that comes in at number 2 and the team that comes in number 6. Auburn and Georgia matched up a rematch. The November game obviously won handily by Auburn. These two teams teaming up again for the SEC championship on Saturday. Do you think one of these two teams has the edge in this game? Is it Auburn because it won so handily the first time? Is it Georgia because it gets a second crack in the rematch? How do you handicap the SEC championship right now?
I have to admit, after the Iron Bowl was over this past weekend, I looked at it and said, I don't know a team that wants to play Auburn right now. But once I started looking at this game a little closer, you look at the fact that both of Auburn's losses are on the road away from Jordan-Hare Stadium. Georgia's only loss is on the road at Auburn. And so I think when you put those two things together, I want to see how Auburn's front 7 really answers the call on this neutral site field, playing against a Georgia team that's probably going to have a ton of fans in the stands. I don't know which one I really give the angle to right now, but I know that Kirby Smart is looking at Nick Saban's game plan against Auburn. Even though Kerryon Johnson got 104 yards, it was only 3.3 yards per carry, and they're going to try to limit what Auburn's able to do. I think that Georgia right now, on the outside looking in, the fact that they're getting this on a neutral site instead of going to Auburn right now, I tend to give Georgia a little bit of an edge.
Well, it's funny that you would say that because there's some data that backs it up as well. And if I was an Auburn fan, here's the thing I would be concerned about. I saw my team dominate Georgia on both lines of scrimmage, and yet no one's giving me a lot of credit for that this week. Vegas has made this only about a 1.5 advantage in favor of Auburn. The FPI data from ESPN gives this thing like a 50.5 to 49.5 edge in favor of Auburn. If I'm an Auburn fan, I say, why didn't my 40-17 win matter more to some of this data, folks? And if I'm going to be objective, I'm going to say, do they?
I think Auburn's an excellent football team. I think that Kerryon Johnson is one of the best backs in the league. He's a little nicked up now. I think that Jared Stidham's has been playing out of his mind for the last few weeks, and they deserve a ton of credit for that. But can they keep that train going? Can they go to a neutral site game where really not many players, if at all, on either one of these teams have ever been in a game of that magnitude? I think that Georgia right now is sitting back. They enjoyed a comfortable victory that didn't really bruise them up a lot against Georgia Tech. And they're kind of, mending their nicks and bruises, and they're kind of looking at that Iron Bowl saying, man, that's a really physical matchup. And right now, both their attentions are faced towards each other on the field.
Let me talk to you about the Alabama situation here for a moment on our Path to Playoff show presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. They're ranked ahead of Georgia, but jealous of Georgia as well, because Georgia's got it's win and you're in type ticket to be punched in the SEC championship. Alabama doesn't have that. I think we would all agree that Alabama's still alive, but we'd also add to that discussion, Alabama needs some help. What help does Alabama need? Lay this out for me. I don't know if I need to give you turn this into like a whiteboard, dry erase. Yes, start showing me some math, but lay out to me Alabama's path to the playoffs.
Well, and here's my opinion. I think that when you look at the ACC and the SEC championship games, that's winning you're in. I think that, whether it be Auburn or Georgia, Clemson or Miami, whoever wins those games are automatically locked in. I think that Oklahoma's a lock, obviously, if they're able to beat TCU. But then you have these Alabama who's not going to play in a championship game, and they're kind of meeting the possibility of maybe playing against an Ohio State 2-loss team or a USC 2-loss team, TCU if they can knock off Oklahoma. I think where things are on the outside looking in for Alabama is if Oklahoma and Wisconsin both win handily, I don't see a way for Alabama to get in and really surpass those four teams. I think that if Oklahoma and Wisconsin win, then you're looking at ACC champion, SEC champion, and then Big 12 and Big 10 champion. So they have to have some help. They would love it if TCU would possibly win. They would love it if Ohio State would win. But right now, that's not in their own hands.
Bull Molinari says there are more paths to the playoff involving two SEC teams than just one, and I don't agree with that. And listen, let me be completely honest about something. There is a reason why we do this show parallel to the one that's on TV, because I feel like on this show, we're able to say some things they're not going to say on TV. And you know what I'm about to say here. I know you don't like this, and I don't say this to troll you. I just believe it's an absolute fact. Folks, I do not believe this committee that's ultimately designing a TV product, I don't believe they're putting three teams from the Deep South in the college football playoff. Yeah. Clemson's going to win the ACC. Either Alabama, or I should say either Auburn or Georgia win the SEC. That's two Deep South teams right there. That's not great for television ratings to have half the playoff come from one part of the country. Alabama, as the sort of at-large team involved in that mix, you are shooting the ratings in a foot if you put three teams from the Deep South in the college football playoff. And Mike, the response here is, yeah, but Alabama-Auburn's the highest rated game in the regular season. That's compared to regular season numbers. They want a much higher rating for the playoff, and they need cross-sections of America to provide that. That's not what I want to be true. To a certain extent, I think the committee's a sham, but this is how they operate. They've done this for 3 years in a row.
And I understand that. I understand that way of thinking. And my only answer to that is to say, you know what? The committee, first of all, they're made up from people all over the country. They're made up from SEC people, Big Ten people. They understand how college football is really ran. They also understand that the heart of college football is in the Deep South. It relies on Atlanta, Georgia, and New Orleans, and some of these other places in the South. I think they lick their chops when they think about a possible Sugar Bowl matchup between Clemson and Alabama. A replay of the national championship game last year that could possibly set up for an Iron Bowl national title game. I think the committee licks their chops when they look at scenarios like that. I don't know if all those teams play out. I don't even know who wins this weekend if we look at all the games encompassed. But I don't think geographically those scenarios are able to play themselves out. I think that you're going to look at it and you're going to try to put everything in the basket and pull out. Is it USC? Is it Ohio State? I think if nothing else, the committee's tired of putting Ohio State in and these Big Ten teams not holding up their end of the bar.
One more point about Alabama here. Stacy Noble in the comments section says, Alabama shouldn't be in it. It's not going to win its conference. But we've seen last year that didn't matter. Ohio State got in without winning a conference. And frankly, I think it ought to be the four best teams. It doesn't need to be conference champions, at least for me. But I can understand the argument the other way, too. But in terms of the Alabama resume, has Alabama done enough to be here? What wins do you point to? I mean, last year you can poke holes at Ohio State, but Ohio State beat three teams that finished the season in the top 10. Right. That was its path to playoff. It beat top 10 teams. What wins do you point to for Alabama and say that's why they deserve the playoff?
Well, I don't look at it from that angle. I look at it as they probably played in one of the toughest divisions in college football. When you look at the fact that Mississippi State and LSU are still ranked inside the top 25, and Auburn is the number 2 team in the country right now. It's hard for me to look at these games and understand that Alabama tried to play Florida State in a big game this year. It just so happens that one of the other top college football programs in the country right now is Auburn, who they played in the last weekend of the season. So I understand everybody's sentiment that Alabama, kind of blew its shot. But when you look at the one loss they've had on the road, by 14 points to Auburn right now, I don't look at that as a bad loss. I think there's a lot of other teams out there that have those losses that line up and compare in a worse light than Alabama's one to Auburn.
All right, let me tell you what we're going to do here. We're going to come back to Alabama in a moment. We're going to come back to Georgia and Auburn in a moment. We're going to figure out who's in the college football playoff before we're done here. That's Mike Johnson. I'm Brandon Adams. We're glad to have you with us here on Academy Sports and Outdoors. Path to Playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors, for all, for less. Before we get serious about our actual Final Four picks and how we think these games are going to work out this weekend, can we bounce around some of the rest of these SEC teams Absolutely. Just for a moment? Do you mind if we do that? Let me start with LSU, who does come in at number 17 tonight. My expectation was LSU would have been a little higher. But now that the season's all said and done, I'm going to ask you a question that I asked you a week ago. How do LSU fans feel about this season? Are they happy? 17's actually lower than the preseason ranking was, but higher than we thought it would have been at some point in September. This feels like a relevant question for me. Was this a successful first year for Ed Orgeron?
I think it was. Obviously, the black eye is going to be the Troy game. No LSU fan wants to talk about the Troy game. It was a terrible loss for them. It didn't really look like they showed up to play that night. But I think if you talk to LSU fans right now, they're pretty excited about the future of the program. Ed Orgeron was able to turn things around. They still have Matt Canada on staff, even though some of the front page articles are naming Matt Canada trying to go other places. They're a good football team. I think they're excited about next year. You're going to lose some big pieces when you talk about Darius Geis and Danny Etling, but you have a lot of young talent. We talked so many times this year on SEC Country Live about the youth of that offensive line, how many freshmen they had really in the two deep on the offensive line. Well, guess what? All those players are coming back, and now it's going to be a strength of the team. Now you have guys that have played in big games like this. You have Devin White that's going to be returning at the linebacker position. I don't know what the future holds for Arden Key, but he didn't have a great year. Maybe he returns too. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Miles Brennan going to be taking the snaps at quarterback. If you're an LSU fan, I think you're looking at next year and saying this might be our year.
I'm going to give credit to LSU here because I think at the end of the season they had a chance for some letdowns, some slip-ups that didn't occur. Tennessee on the road, believe it or not, there was a chance, especially in bad weather, for LSU not to have its focus. It did against Texas A&M. A&M had nothing to play for, but maybe LSU could have also lost its focus. It certainly lost it plenty of times early in the season. Yeah. Didn't happen. I'm actually going to go out on this season giving Orgeron a little bit of credit for that.
And you should. And listen, I think we all wondered a couple times early on in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the year, is this job too big for Ed Orgeron? Yeah. Made a couple questionable calls. All of a sudden he's got Miles Brennan in against Syracuse, a Syracuse team that beat Clemson, by the way. And I think things started to shape back into order. You started getting guys healthy. Darius Geis got healthy. Arden Key got healthy. And this team started playing as a unit. I don't know what it took for Ed Orgeron to get it turned back around, but somehow he's able to find it.
And let me bring in one more SEC team here, and then we'll move back. The teams have a chance to be in the playoff. Mississippi State kind of coming at number 23 this week. My assumption is they'll finish the season there. They're obviously not going to play next Saturday. I feel like for Mississippi State, who has a lot of reason to be down right now, no Dan Mullen, he takes the Florida job. Embarrassing performance in the Egg Bowl for the most part. And yet, I feel like there aren't that many teams where a new coach gets to inherit a top 25 team with a lot of talent and starters returning. I think the future is actually brighter at Mississippi State than it may initially appear on the basis of what the next coach is going to get and the fact that better coaches are going to be interested in this job because of where it finishes this season, even with the loss to Ole Miss, and who it's bringing back.
Yeah, well, you didn't even mention the Nick Fitzgerald injury. He's going to have a ton of an uphill climb this offseason, getting back from that gruesome leg injury that he suffered this past weekend. I need to know who the head coach is going to be. Are we going to have a head coach that's going to be able to come in and foster what Nick Fitzgerald has made, in the same way that Dan Mullen would have? Or are they going to have to turn the page and be something else? I'm not sure who they're going to bring in. A lot of things still up in the ear. You're hearing Mike Norvell. You're hearing Jeremy Pruitt. You're hearing names from all over the country that possibly take over this program. They've got to find another Dan Mullen, a guy that can do more with less. Those guys aren't growing on trees, but I think if you're the Mississippi State fan base right now, you do feel pretty good about the talent you do have returning in Starkville.
All right, before we give our official picks for who we think is going to be in the top 4 come Sunday, and by the way, we'll be back here with you on Sunday afternoon to bring you the action as it happens once again. And listen, if you think this debate's intense, wait till you see what happens on Sunday. Once again, here's what happened tonight. Clemson at 1, Auburn at 2, Oklahoma 3, Wisconsin 4, Alabama and Georgia, a couple SEC teams coming in at 5 and 6. That's our top 6 tonight on our path to playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. We'll be here on Sunday to talk more about that. But as a precursor to what our top 4 is going to be, I was taking a look at some of this information before we get ready to start the show. And Ohio State's an underdog to Wisconsin. I'm going to push that game aside for a moment. Let's look at 2 of these other games. One of these that has a great impact on the SEC's push to get 2 teams in. You got TCU as an underdog to Oklahoma. They're about a touchdown or so underdog. Yep. You've got Miami, a bigger underdog than that, to Clemson. They're like a 9.5-point underdog, despite the fact they were ranked number 2 last week. Outright upset. More likely to happen for TCU or Miami? You got a choice for me on that?
I'm actually going to go with TCU in that game. And I know that everybody points to Oklahoma's offense and says, man, they've scored basically 60 on everybody they've played. And that includes Ohio State on the road going in that stadium. But this is another one of those games that I look at much like Georgia and Auburn, where guess what? This is one of those games where they played head up already one time this year. It's really hard to beat the same team twice in 1 year. I think TCU is a really well-coached team. And I expect them to go out and play a lot better when they face Oklahoma. Miami, to me, for everything they've done well this year and for all the hype they've kind of involved surrounding college football with the turnover chain and everything they've done with Mark Richt, he's the ACC Coach of the Year. I just have too much respect for Clemson right now as a defending national champion and how they've handled business for most of the season to think that Miami is going to go in there and upset Clemson. To me, TCU is the answer right now. They're getting another shot at an Oklahoma team that they've seen before, and they're a really good football team and can score points in their own right.
What I like about TCU is it is that tough defense for a team like Oklahoma. It's been coasting all season long. It can't be that easy every single week. I mean, I think it's the worst kind of opponent for them to play in a conference championship, a rematch against a really good defense. defensive coach, and I just think Miami's a joke. In terms of the national championship conversation, a team that's using a real huge turnover margin and close games at halftime, that's not a national champion. And Clemson showed they are at least in that caliber without playing against South Carolina. I see no upset coming in the ACC championship.
And really, I'm happy for Miami fans. I think that you and I have talked about this. When Miami is good, it's better for college football. They're one of those programs like Florida, like some of the other teams in the South, that when they're good, it makes for an exciting race. By the way, it's the first time Miami's ever been to an ACC championship game. So none of those players have been in this scenario. I think it's going to be an uphill battle to try to dethrone the defending national champions and ACC champions in Clemson. But I love what Miami's done so far. I think they have something to build on going into next year.
Dwayne Tick Coleman says TCU is going to beat Oklahoma, and I don't want to give my stuff away here, but I actually agree. and here's the thing to understand. We do this every day on SEC Country here as well. There is no way I'm going to go out with chalk, and chalk means the teams are expected to win. Yep. I just can't do that. So why don't we, since Dwayne gets this conversation started, why don't we roll into this? Let's reveal who we think our top 4 is going to be. And for me, it's not Oklahoma. I don't have Oklahoma in my top 4. I am going to go Georgia. I am going to go Clemson, but I'm taking Oklahoma out. I'm going to put the Big Ten champion. I hate to do this. I think it's Ohio State. My 4th team, USC.
Man, you USC.
What's wrong with me? Georgia, Clemson, USC, Ohio State.
Boy, you are putting two-loss conference champions in over Alabama. Listen, I wouldn't say that that's the most crazy thing I've ever heard. I think that if both those two teams win, you're definitely going to have that conversation. My teams don't quite read like that. I've got a little bit of chalk in mind, and Alabama slides up a spot. I've got Clemson. I think they win against Miami handily. I think they're probably the best team in the country next to Oklahoma, who I have at number 2. I have them beating TCU this weekend. Oklahoma, to me, Baker Mayfield, the Heisman Trophy winner, that's already a foregone conclusion in my mind. I think he balls out against TCU this weekend and makes his final claim to win that trophy the following week. After that, I know Auburn fans are going to hate me for these next 2 I have in the standings right now. Auburn's loss to LSU really looming large this weekend when you talk about how this plays out. But I've got Georgia winning that SEC title game, sitting there at number 3 after this weekend's all played out. I think that Georgia gets their revenge on Auburn in the neutral field. I think they have a good enough team to be able to get that done. And then right there at number 4, the Alabama Crimson Tide. That's just sliding up one spot from some of the losses you're going to see in front of them. I really feel like they're going to get the benefit of the doubt over a 2-loss Ohio State and a 2-loss USC.
Who you think does win you think Ohio State wins the Big Ten?
I think that Ohio State wins the Big Ten. I think they have to if Alabama's going to have to slide up. I don't know that they put an Alabama 1-loss team in over a conference champion Wisconsin. I'm not so sure about USC. I think Stanford's playing incredibly well when you look at the way they have kind of rounded their season into form. That round robin between Stanford, Notre Dame, and USC, you've kind of seen what all those teams are. I'm not so sure that USC does win that game, but even if they do, I'm not sure they'd slide in front of Alabama.
It is a conversation that's going to be intense, no doubt about it. Can we show the top 6 one more time before we get ready to get out of here? Here's where it's ranked tonight. Clemson at 1, Auburn at 2, Oklahoma 3, Wisconsin at 4, Alabama 5, Georgia 6. Where will they be ranked on Sunday? We got a lot of football this weekend that's going to help tell the story for that. For more coverage for your team involved in the playoff or not, make sure you check out SECCountry.com. Thanks for being with us here tonight on our path to the playoff, presented by Academy Sports and Outdoors. 4 all, 4 less. We'll be back on Sunday. The games will be over. The rankings will be out. We'll be debating. We'll see you then. Thanks for being with us.